The year was 1631, and across the blood-soaked battlefields of Germany, a legend was about to be born. In the midst of Europe's most devastating conflict, when Catholic armies seemed unstoppable and Protestant hopes lay shattered like the ruins of Magdeburg, a young king from the frozen north prepared to change the course of history forever. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, and he would earn a title that would echo through the centuries, the Lion of the North. But this is more than just the story of one battle. This is the story of how a 16-year-old boy inherited a bankrupt kingdom fighting 3 wars it couldn't win, and transformed it into the most feared military machine in Europe. How revolutionary tactics born in the snowy forests of Sweden would shatter the invincible Spanish tercios that had dominated battlefields for over a century, and how one September afternoon near a small German village called Breitenfeld would prove that the age of medieval warfare was dead, and the modern era had begun. By 1631, the 30 Years' War had already consumed Europe for 13 brutal years. What began as a religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant states had evolved into something far more terrifying, a continental nightmare of pillaging armies, starving civilians, and cities reduced to ash. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. In some German regions, the population had been cut by 2/3. Entire towns simply vanished from maps. Children grew up knowing nothing but the thunder of cannon and the smoke of burning villages. The Catholic forces, led by the Holy Roman Empire, seemed unstoppable. Their Spanish-trained tercios, massive squares of pikemen and musketeers, had crushed Protestant resistance across Central Europe. These formations were like moving fortresses, some containing 3,000 men arranged in ranks 30 deep. They advanced with the slow, grinding inevitability of glaciers, bristling with steel points that could shatter cavalry charges and absorb musket volleys. For over a century, no army had found an answer to the tercio. Until now, in the frozen kingdom of Sweden, a different kind of warrior had been watching. Gustavus Adolphus was not your typical medieval monarch. Born on December 9th, 1594, he ascended to the Swedish throne at just 16 years old, inheriting a kingdom that most European courts considered a frozen backwater. Sweden was poor, isolated, and surrounded by enemies. The Danes controlled the Baltic Straits. The Russians pressed from the east. The Poles threatened from the south. By any reasonable measure, Sweden should have been carved up and forgotten, but Gustavus Adolphus was not reasonable. He was extraordinary. Standing tall and powerfully built, with steel blue eyes that seemed to pierce through men's souls, he possessed something that couldn't be taught or inherited: vision. While other kings collected titles and treasures, Gustavus collected ideas. He studied the military innovations of Maurice of Nassau in the Dutch Republic. He analyzed the failures of Protestant armies in Germany. Most importantly, he understood that warfare itself was evolving, and whoever adapted first would dominate the continent. The young king's transformation of Sweden began with a revolutionary concept: professional armies. While most European forces consisted of hired mercenaries who fought for pay and plunder, Gustavus created something unprecedented: a national army of Swedish soldiers who fought for their country, their faith, and their king. Through his Ordinance of Military Personnel issued in 1620, he required each province to organize men into units of 10, from which the military would draft specified numbers. These weren't temporary levies or seasonal fighters. These were career soldiers, drilled constantly, equipped standardly, and motivated by something beyond mere coin. But Gustavus understood that motivation alone wouldn't defeat the tercios. He needed tactical innovation. Traditional European armies fought in deep, cumbersome formations that moved like lumbering beasts across battlefields. The Spanish tercio, while nearly invulnerable, was slow to maneuver and vulnerable to faster, more flexible opponents. Gustavus began experimenting with linear formations, spreading his men across wider fronts in shallower ranks. Where the Spanish fought 30 men deep, the Swedes fought only 6 deep, sometimes as few as 3. This gave them devastating firepower across a much broader area. The key breakthrough came with artillery. Traditional cannon were massive, unwieldy monsters that took teams of oxen to move and could fire perhaps once every 10 minutes. Gustavus revolutionized field artillery by creating lightweight guns that could be moved by a single horse or carried by 2 men. His famous 3-pounder regimental guns could fire every minute, providing direct support to infantry formations. For the first time in European warfare, artillery became truly mobile, moving with the army rather than being positioned and forgotten. Even more revolutionary was his approach to combined arms. Previous armies treated cavalry, infantry, and artillery as separate entities that occasionally cooperated. Gustavus created integrated formations where mounted troops, foot soldiers, and gunners worked as a single organism. His cavalry could charge from behind the protection of infantry lines reinforced by cannon, then retreat safely to regroup, while artillery covered their withdrawal. It was warfare as symphony, with each element harmonizing to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The Swedish military machine that emerged from these innovations was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Cross-trained soldiers who could serve artillery, fight as infantry, or support cavalry operations. Officers promoted on merit rather than birth. Standardized equipment that could be rapidly replaced and repaired. Most importantly, a tactical doctrine that emphasized aggression, mobility, and concentrated firepower over static defense. By 1630, when Gustavus finally landed in northern Germany with his revolutionary army, he brought only 4,000 men. But these weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the product of 2 decades of military innovation, hardened by campaigns against Denmark, Russia, and Poland. They moved faster than their enemies, shot more accurately, and fought with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural to observers accustomed to the chaotic melees of traditional warfare. The Protestant cause in Germany had never needed salvation more desperately. The previous year had witnessed the horror of Magdeburg, where Catholic forces had massacred nearly 30,000 civilians in what became known as the worst atrocity of the 30 Years' War. Protestant princes across the Holy Roman Empire lived in terror, knowing that their cities might be next. Some had already submitted to imperial authority. Others waited in desperate hope for a deliverer. That deliverer had arrived, but few recognized him initially.
Yes.
The German Protestant princes were cautious about allying with a foreign king, even
Our
one who
forces
shared
are
their
not
faith.
prepared.
They worried that Swedish intervention might provoke even harsher imperial retaliation. Months of careful
We stand
diplomacy
at
were
pivotal
required
moment,
before
and our unity
Gustavus
now
could
will
secure
forge a
meaningful
path to
German
lasting
allies.
peace.
The Swedish king grew increasingly frustrated as valuable time slipped away while Protestant cities fell to Catholic armies. The breakthrough came in 1631, when imperial forces under the command of Johann Circles, Count of Tilly, invaded Saxony. Tilly was the Catholic League's most experienced general, a veteran of countless campaigns who had never lost a major battle. His army of 35,000 men represented the finest military force the Catholic powers could field. These weren't raw recruits or temporary levies. They were professional soldiers who had campaigned for over a decade from the Bohemian mountains to the Baltic shore. Their 17 tercios contained 25,000 of the most experienced infantry in the world. When Tilly threatened to sack Leipzig unless Saxon forces disbanded, John George I, Elector of Saxony, finally agreed to ally with the Swedish king. The two armies united near Duel on September 14th, creating a combined Protestant force of nearly 40,000 men. But numbers alone wouldn't determine the outcome of what was coming. This would be a clash between 2 completely different philosophies of warfare. The grinding, methodical approach of the Spanish school against the lightning-fast innovations of the Swedish system. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through military history for centuries to come. The morning of September 17th, 1631, dawned crisp and clear across the Saxon countryside. Mist clung to the fields around the village of Breitenfeld as 2 of Europe's most formidable armies prepared for what would become the most decisive battle of the 30 Years' War. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the very earth understood that history was about to pivot on the events of this single day. Count Tilly had chosen his ground with the cold calculation of a master tactician. The plain near Breitenfeld offered the perfect terrain for his massive tercios to deploy in their full, terrifying glory. These formations had crushed every opponent they had faced for over a century. Row upon row of Spanish-trained soldiers, their pikes creating a forest of steel points that glinted in the morning sunday. Behind them, musketeers loaded with practiced efficiency, ready to pour devastating volleys into any force foolish enough to approach within range. The Imperial army spread across the battlefield like a dark tide, 35,000 strong. Veterans all, these men had marched through the smoking ruins of Protestant cities from Prague to the Baltic. They knew victory the way wolves know the hunt. Their banners snapped in the autumn breeze, displaying the eagles of the Holy Roman Empire and the crosses of the Catholic League. To any observer, they appeared invincible, a force of nature that had swept aside every enemy for over a decade. Across the field, a very different army was taking shape. Gustavus Adolphus sat astride his war horse, his steel blue eyes surveying the imperial formations with the calm intensity of a master craftsman examining his materials. At 36 years old, the Swedish king had already revolutionized warfare. But this would be his masterpiece. Everything he had learned, every innovation he had developed, every tactical breakthrough he had achieved would be tested against the finest army Catholic Europe could produce. The contrast was immediately apparent to anyone who understood military formations, where Tilly's tercios stood in massive deep blocks that seemed to root themselves into the earth. The Swedish lines spread thin and flexible across a much wider front. Gustavus had arranged his forces in the new linear style, with infantry formations only 6 ranks deep, supported by his revolutionary mobile artillery. Between the infantry battalions, his famous 3-pounder guns waited like sleeping predators, ready to unleash rapid fire that could tear apart enemy formations. On the Swedish right wing, the king himself would lead the cavalry. These weren't the traditional heavy horsemen who charged once and withdrew. Gustavus had trained his mounted troops to fight in coordination with infantry and artillery, creating a tactical flexibility that no European army had ever achieved. They could charge, withdraw, regroup, and charge again, all while remaining under the protective umbrella of Swedish firepower. The left wing presented a different challenge. Here stood the Saxon allies, 16,000 men under John George I. These troops were brave enough, but they lacked the intensive training and innovative tactics of their Swedish partners. Gustavus knew they represented the weak
Check your
point
muskets,
in his
men.
line.
Ensure every part is secure.
Political necessity demanded their
God be
inclusion.
with us.
The battle would be won or lost based on how well the Swedish innovations could compensate for Saxon limitations. As the morning advanced, both armies completed their deployments. The ritual of pre-battle preparation unfolded with deadly precision. Weapons were checked, prayers were offered, and final orders passed down through the ranks. The Swedish soldiers moved with the fluid efficiency of a well-oiled machine, each man knowing exactly his role in the complex tactical symphony about to unfold. Their officers, promoted on merit rather than birth, commanded with quiet confidence born of countless hours of drill and real combat experience. In contrast, the Imperial forces prepared with the massive, deliberate movements of their tercio system. These formations were like great ships of war, powerful but slow to change direction once committed to action. Within each tercio, thousands of men checked their equipment and steeled themselves for battle. Many were veterans who had seen Protestant armies shatter against their disciplined ranks time and again. They expected this day to follow the familiar pattern of Imperial victory. The battle began not with the clash of steel, but with thunder. Artillery from both sides opened fire simultaneously, sending iron balls screaming across the autumn air. For 2 hours, the cannons dueled while infantry formations waited in tense anticipation. But already, the Swedish advantages were becoming apparent. Gustavus's mobile guns fired 3 times faster than the traditional Imperial artillery, pouring a steady rain of shot into the enemy formations. The Swedish gunners had been cross-trained to work seamlessly with infantry and cavalry. They could rapidly shift targets, concentrate fire on breakthrough points, or provide covering fire for advancing troops. This wasn't the static artillery duel that characterized most European battles. This was dynamic, responsive firepower that adapted to changing battlefield conditions with unprecedented speed. When Tilly finally ordered his cavalry to charge both flanks of the Protestant line, the true test of Swedish innovations began. On the left wing, the Saxon troops crumbled almost immediately under the thunderous assault of Imperial horsemen. Decades of Spanish military tradition proved their worth, as disciplined cavalry smashed through formations that lacked the training and cohesion to resist such an attack. Within minutes, 16,000 Saxon soldiers were streaming from the battlefield in complete panic. But on the Swedish right wing, a very different drama unfolded. As Imperial cavalry thundered toward the Swedish lines, Gustavus's innovations revealed their deadly potential. The thin linear formations that had appeared so vulnerable suddenly bristled with coordinated firepower. Infantry volleys crashed into the charging horsemen, while mobile artillery poured canister shot into their ranks. The Swedish cavalry, rather than meeting the attack head-on, used their superior training to strike at flanks and weak points before withdrawing to safety behind their own infantry lines. The Imperial cavalry, expecting to sweep aside another Protestant formation, instead found themselves trapped in a killing field of concentrated fire. Horses screamed and fell as Swedish musket balls found their marks. Riders tumbled from their saddles as artillery tore gaps in their ranks. What should have been a decisive charge became a costly failure as the survivors retreated in confusion. Now came the moment that would determine the fate of Protestant Germany. With the Saxon collapse exposing the entire left flank of his army, Gustavus faced the classic tactical dilemma that had destroyed countless commanders throughout history. He could retreat and preserve his remaining forces, or he could gamble everything on the revolutionary tactics he had spent decades developing. Gustavus Adolphus chose to attack. The Swedish king's decision to attack in the face of such overwhelming disadvantage would have been considered madness by every military manual of the age. But Gustavus Adolphus was writing new rules of warfare with each passing moment. As the Saxon rout exposed his left flank to inevitable destruction, the Lion of the North did something that defied every conventional wisdom of European battlefields. He ordered his entire army to wheel left in advance. What followed was a display of military coordination that left seasoned observers speechless. The Swedish formations moved like living organisms, each element responding instantly to changing conditions. As the second-line troops pivoted to cover the abandoned Saxon positions, the main Swedish force began a methodical advance that showcased every innovation Gustavus had developed over 2 decades of military revolution. The mobile artillery pieces rolled forward with the infantry, their crews working with mechanical precision. Load, aim, fire, reload. Every 60 seconds, iron shots screamed across the narrowing gap between the armies. But this wasn't random bombardment. Swedish gunners had been trained to identify weak points in enemy formations and concentrate their fire with devastating effect. Gaps began appearing in the previously impenetrable tercio walls as casualties mounted under the relentless barrage. Meanwhile, Count Tilly watched his seemingly certain victory slipping away with each Swedish advance. The Imperial commander had built his reputation on the crushing power of massed formations, but he was witnessing something unprecedented. An enemy that refused to break under pressure, that adapted and counterattacked instead of retreating. His tercios, so effective against traditional opponents, were struggling to respond to tactics they had never encountered. The genius of Gustavus's system revealed itself in these crucial minutes. While Tilly's massive formations required extensive time and space to maneuver, the Swedish linear formations could respond to threats with lightning speed. When Imperial cavalry attempted to exploit gaps in the Swedish line, mobile reserves filled them instantly. When tercio formations tried to advance, concentrated artillery fire forced them back. The Swedes fought like a single organism, each part supporting every other part in perfect harmony. But the true masterstroke was yet to come. As the Imperial forces struggled to adapt to Swedish tactics, Gustavus personally led his cavalry in a flanking maneuver that would be studied in military academies for centuries. Rather than charging directly into the enemy formations, the Swedish horsemen swept around the Imperial left wing in a wide arc that brought them behind Tilly's artillery positions. The moment when Swedish cavalry seized the Imperial guns marked the beginning of the end for Catholic supremacy in Germany. Suddenly, Tilly's own artillery was turned against his formations. Swedish gunners, cross-trained in multiple military disciplines, quickly mastered the captured cannon and began pouring devastating fire into the rear of the tercio formations. The Imperial soldiers found themselves caught in a crossfire between their own guns and the advancing Swedish infantry. Panic began to spread through the Imperial ranks like wildfire. These were veteran soldiers who had never known defeat. but they were experiencing something beyond their training or experience. The Swedish rate of fire was overwhelming their traditional defensive measures. Musket volleys that should have taken minutes to reload were coming every 30 seconds. Artillery that should have been static was moving and firing in constant support of infantry advances. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. For over a century, the Spanish tercio system had represented military invincibility. These formations had conquered the Netherlands, dominated Italian battlefields, and crushed Protestant resistance across Central Europe. They were more than military units. They were symbols of Catholic power and Habsburg supremacy. Watching them crumble under Swedish innovations shattered the confidence of men who had never doubted their superiority. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the Swedish pressure became irresistible. Gustavus had positioned his forces in a vast semicircle that enveloped the Imperial army from three sides. Mobile artillery poured concentrated fire into the densely packed tercio formations,
hang in there, General!
While Swedish infantry advanced with disciplined volleys that cut down anyone who tried to resist. The Imperial cavalry, scattered and demoralized by their earlier failures, could provide no effective support. Count Tilly himself, wounded and barely conscious, was carried through the field as his army disintegrated around him. The man who had never lost a battle watched helplessly as his reputation crumbled along with his formations. Veterans who had marched triumphantly through Protestant cities were now fleeing in panic across the Saxon countryside. Banners that had flown over a dozen victories lay trampled in the mud beside their fallen bearers. The collapse, when it came, was total. 17 tercios that had begun the day as the most feared military formations in Europe dissolved into fleeing mobs of desperate men. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered immediately. Others tried to fight their way free, only to be cut down by Swedish cavalry that seemed to appear everywhere at once. The roads leading away from Breitenfeld became killing grounds as organized retreat turned into chaotic rout. Swedish soldiers, many of whom had never faced such experienced opponents, could hardly believe what they were witnessing. The legendary Spanish infantry, the terror of Protestant Europe, was running like rabbits before their disciplined advance. Weapons, supplies, and treasure lay scattered across the battlefield as Imperial forces abandoned everything in their desperate flight to safety. The human cost of the battle told the story of tactical revolution with brutal clarity. Imperial casualties numbered over 17,000 killed, wounded, or captured. An additional 6,000 soldiers, mostly mercenaries who had fought for pay rather than conviction, immediately enlisted in the Swedish army. The weapons captured included all of Tilly's artillery plus enough small arms to equip several new regiments. In contrast, Swedish losses barely exceeded 3,000 men. The revolutionary tactics that Gustavus had developed had not only defeated a superior force, but had done so with minimal friendly casualties. This wasn't just victory. This was proof that warfare itself had fundamentally changed. The age of massive, slow-moving formations was ending. The era of mobile, coordinated, combined arms had begun.
We are resolved to join the Swedish cause.
Breitenfeld, news of the Swedish triumph spread like lightning across Protestant Europe. In cities that had cowered under the threat of Imperial occupation, church bells rang out in celebration. Princes who had hesitated to oppose Habsburg power suddenly found courage to join the Swedish cause. The balance of the 30 Years' War had shifted dramatically in a single afternoon of revolutionary combat. But for Gustavus Adolphus, standing amid the wreckage of Imperial power, this was only the beginning. The magnitude of what had been achieved at Breitenfeld resonated far beyond the muddy fields where Imperial banners now lay trampled in Saxon soil. As word of the Swedish victory spread across the war-torn landscape of Central Europe,
Indeed, Your Highness.
it carried with it something that Protestant Germany had not felt for over a decade. In Dresden, the Elector proclaimed September 17th a permanent holiday. Church bells that had remained silent for years now rang out across cities that had lived under the constant shadow of imperial terror. Princes who had submitted to Habsburg authority out of fear began quietly reaching out to Swedish envoys. The myth of Catholic invincibility, carefully constructed through years of military dominance, had shattered in a single afternoon of Swedish steel and Swedish genius. But the psychological impact extended far beyond mere political calculations. The common people of Germany, who had endured 13 years of pillaging armies and burned villages, suddenly dared to believe that their nightmare might have an ending. Swedish soldiers were no longer foreign invaders to be feared. They had become liberators, proof that the seemingly unstoppable tide of Catholic conquest could be turned back by courage, innovation, and superior tactics. The strategic implications were equally profound. Within weeks of Breitenfeld, the entire political map of Central Europe began to shift.
We agree to your
declared
terms.
For the Swedish cause. The Hessian dukes
Excellent.
abandoned their
Now we can
neutrality.
proceed.
Brandenburg, which had wavered for months between imperial pressure and Protestant loyalty, finally chose sides. Even France, officially Catholic but terrified of Habsburg dominance, increased its financial support for Swedish operations dramatically. Gustavus Adolphus found himself in a position no Protestant leader had occupied since the war began. He could choose his next move from a position of strength rather than desperation. The road south toward Bavaria lay open. The path west toward the Rhine beckoned with promises of further conquest. Most tempting of all, the route toward Vienna itself seemed achievable for the first time in generations. The Swedish king understood that Breitenfeld was not an ending but a beginning. The Imperial forces would regroup, reinforcements would arrive from Spain and Italy, and new generals would emerge to replace the wounded Tilly. But something fundamental had changed in the calculus of European warfare. The tactical innovations that had seemed like interesting experiments in the forests of Sweden had proven themselves against the finest army Catholic Europe could produce. In that moment, standing victorious on the fields of Breitenfeld, Gustavus Adolphus had done more than win a battle. He had shattered the foundations of medieval warfare and ushered in the modern age of military science. The Lion of the North had proven that innovation could triumph over tradition, that a small nation with superior tactics could humble the greatest empire in the world. His revolutionary methods would echo through history, studied by Napoleon, admired by Clausewitz, and copied by every military commander who understood that the future belonged to those bold enough to rewrite the rules of war.